intercepted every single threat. No American ship was struck. And then the US responded by hitting Iranian missile launch sites, command and control facilities, and surveillance infrastructure along the coastline. President Trump went on Truth Social and wrote that there was no damage done to the 3 destroyers, but great damage done to the Iranian attackers. He called it a love tap to reporters. But here's what nobody in mainstream media is stopping to explain to you: what this event actually means in the architecture of global power, global economics, and the future of a world order that is fracturing in real time right before our eyes. Because this isn't just about 3 ships, this is about who controls the arteries of the global economy. Until this war began, approximately 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through that narrow strip of water we call the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that number for a moment. 1 in 4 barrels of oil shipped anywhere on this planet moved through a passage of water so narrow you could almost swim across it. And right now, that passage is effectively closed. It has been in one form or another since February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a war against Iran and assassinated Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. What followed was not what the architects of that operation had predicted. Iran didn't fold. Iran closed the door on the global oil market, and now we're all living inside the consequences of that decision. What you need to understand, and what almost no one in the American corporate press is explaining with any real depth, is that this war, and specifically the closure of this strait, has triggered what the International Energy Agency's own director has called the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the largest in recent memory, not the largest since the 1970s, the largest ever, full stop. And yet most Americans are getting this story package as some kind of tactical military update, a chess move between Trump and Tehran, a negotiation drama. What it actually is a civilizational economic rupture that is reshaping the world's power structures, supply chains, trade routes, currency relationships, and the very idea of who gets to set the rules of the international system. So let's actually talk about it, all of it, the way it deserves to be talked about. Let's start with what actually led to May 7th, because context is everything. The US-Israel Joint Air Operation began on February 28th of this year. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had warned President Trump before those strikes were launched. In briefings held before the February 2026 attacks, the Joint Chiefs warned Trump that an attack could prompt Iran to close the strait. Trump acknowledged the warnings but dismissed the possibility, telling his team that Iran would likely capitulate instead of closing the strait, and that if they did, the US military could open it again. That confidence, that combination of strategic overconfidence and wishful thinking, is really the origin story of everything you're now watching unfold. Because Iran didn't capitulate, Iran closed the strait, and it turned out that opening it again was not as simple as the president assumed it would be. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, moved quickly. They issued warnings forbidding passage, boarded merchant ships, and began laying naval mines in the strait. According to one report, Iran lost track of mines that it had planted in the Strait of Hormuz and is therefore unable to fully open the strait even if it wanted to. That detail alone should stop you cold. Think about what that means. You have a heavily trafficked, economically critical waterway that is now laced with untracked naval mines, and even the country that planted them can't be entirely sure where all of them are. The merchant shipping industry understands that risk perfectly. Insurance companies understood it immediately. Protection and indemnity insurance is critical for shipping. Its war risk was removed for March 5th, making the economic risk too high for ship owners to use the strait. When the insurance market walks away from a shipping lane, that lane is effectively dead to commercial traffic. That happened within days of the war starting. Now the economic ripple effects of this decision, the decision to go to war with Iran without a credible plan for keeping the strait open, those effects have been staggering. Following the closure of the Strait of Hormuz on March 4, 2026, oil and LNG exports were stranded, causing Brent crude to surge past $120 per barrel and forcing Qatar Energy to declare force majeure on all exports. Force majeure, that's the legal declaration that says you cannot fulfill your contractual obligations because of circumstances beyond your control. Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG exporters, essentially told every contract partner on the planet that they couldn't deliver, and that matters not just for energy, but for the downstream industries that depend on that energy, which is to say, nearly every industry on Earth. By mid-March, the collective oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE had dropped by at least 10 million barrels per day. 10 million barrels a day. To put that in perspective, Goldman Sachs estimates that the closure of the waterway and attacks on energy infrastructure have reduced global daily production by 14.5 million barrels. That is an almost incomprehensible withdrawal of energy supply from the global market. And markets have responded accordingly. Brent crude is up nearly 50% since the start of the war and has not dropped below $100 a barrel for nearly 2 weeks. Analysts at Bloomberg and elsewhere have begun openly discussing the possibility of oil hitting $170 or even $200 a barrel if the strait remains closed through the summer. U.S. government officials and Wall Street analysts are starting to consider the prospect that oil prices might surge to an unprecedented $200 a barrel. And for regular Americans, this has already showed up in your wallet. Gas prices have risen $1.16 a gallon in the United States since the start of the war, with prices expected to hit $5 a gallon if the Strait of Hormuz is not opened by mid-April. That deadline came and went without resolution. On March 31, 2026, gas prices hit $4 per gallon as the war with Iran caused a surge of 30% in gas prices. And it's not just what you pay at the pump. Jet fuel in North America has spiked 95% since the war began, causing multiple airlines to raise prices for checked baggage. Shipping services such as the United States Postal Service, Amazon, and FedEx implemented fuel surcharges. On May 2, 2026, Spirit Airlines ceased all operations, citing rising fuel costs. An entire airline gone because of a strait that most Americans couldn't locate on a map 3 months ago. But here is where I want to zoom out and look at this from a structural geopolitical level, because what's happening goes far deeper than the price of a barrel of crude. What we are witnessing is a fundamental test of the American-led international order, and specifically, the test of whether the United States can maintain what strategists call freedom of navigation. The principle that international waters are open to all, that no nation can unilaterally close a critical sea lane. This principle underpins the entire post-World War II order. The US Navy has been the guarantor of that order for 80 years. Carrier strike groups have patrolled these waters precisely to prevent exactly this kind of scenario. And yet here we are. Iran has effectively closed the strait since late February, and every effort to reopen it has encountered a new layer of complexity, a new layer of danger, and a new layer of political friction. The Trump administration launched what it called Project Freedom, an initiative to escort commercial ships through the strait using American destroyers, aircraft, and naval assets. It includes guided missile destroyers, over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms, and 15,000 service members. On the first day of the operation, the USS Truxtun and the USS Mason, supported by Apache helicopters and other aircraft, faced a series of coordinated threats during the passage. Iran launched small boats, missiles, and drones against them in what officials described as a sustained barrage. Despite the intensity of the attacks, neither U.S. vessel was struck, a partial success on paper. 2 U.S.-flagged commercial ships got through. But then something remarkable happened. Trump paused the operation after just 1 day. The president ended Project Freedom after 1 day because Saudi officials, surprised by the operation, withdrew access to their bases and airspace. Saudi Arabia, America's closest Gulf ally, the cornerstone of the petrodollar relationship, pulled the rug. They didn't want American warships using their territory as a staging ground for an operation that hadn't been properly coordinated with them. That is a significant diplomatic signal. It tells you something about the strains running through alliances that most Washington analysts have long taken for granted. And then came May 7th. 3 destroyers, the Truxtun, the Rafael Peralta, and the Mason, transited the strait. Iran fired everything: missiles, drones, small fast attack boats. The US intercepted it all. No American ships were struck. And then the US struck back, hitting launch sites, command nodes, intelligence infrastructure on Qeshm Island, in Bandar Abbas, in Bandar Kamir and Sirik. Iran's top joint military command accused the US of violating the ceasefire by targeting an Iranian oil tanker and another ship. Iran's press TV later reported that, following several hours of fire, the situation on Iranian islands and coastal cities by the Strait of Hormuz is back to normal. Iran also struck the UAE. The UAE Ministry of Defense confirmed that audible blasts reported throughout the nation stemmed from active operations to intercept and engage incoming missiles and drones coming from Iran. The entire Gulf lit up in a single day. And now, a political scientist at the University of York offered what I think is one of the most honest assessments of the moment. He told Al Jazeera that this eruption in violence could be seen as an escalation, but also demonstrates the volatility of the conflict, with each side potentially seeking to use these strikes to increase their leverage in the ongoing peace negotiations. A former US diplomat and security specialist characterized it as a controlled escalation rather than mere skirmishes, arguing that both nations are trying to show their resolve while attempting to settle on a framework on some key issues. Both of those readings are probably true simultaneously, which is exactly what makes this moment so dangerous. When two nuclear-adjacent powers are using live fire as a negotiating tool while both claiming a ceasefire is still technically in effect, the margin for miscalculation becomes extraordinarily thin. Now, I want to bring this back to something that doesn't get discussed enough, which is the question of what this conflict reveals about the architecture of global power that has been building since the early 2000s. Because Iran didn't just decide one day to be defiant. This crisis is the product of decades of accumulated geopolitical pressure, failed diplomacy, nuclear negotiations in Geneva that went nowhere, and a strategic environment in which Iran had been watching the United States and Israel tighten a strategic noose around its neck for years. Tensions between Iran, the United States, and Israel escalated in the lead-up to 2026, stemming from failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva and a prior 12-day air conflict in 2025. This war didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the predictable outcome of a decade of decisions, sanctions, proxy conflicts, nuclear brinkmanship, assassinations that gradually burned away every diplomatic off-ramp until the only options left were submission or confrontation. And Iran chose confrontation, and the weapon it chose was not a nuclear bomb, it was a strait, a 21-mile-wide bottleneck of water that happens to be the throat through which the global economy breathes. Until this conflict, the Strait of Hormuz was open, and about 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through it. Iran has spent decades understanding that this is its ultimate strategic card, and when the existential moment arrived, when its supreme leader was assassinated and its territory came under direct aerial bombardment, it played that card, and the world has been reckoning with the consequences ever since. The economic damage extends far beyond oil, and this is something that even financially literate people haven't fully absorbed yet. The Persian Gulf is also a major hub for global fertilizer production and exports. In the 2020s, the region has accounted for roughly 30 to 35% of global urea exports and around 20 to 30% of ammonia exports. Overall, up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers normally transit the Strait of Hormuz. Fertilizer. Think about what that means for food production. You cannot grow corn and wheat at industrial scale without fertilizer. You cannot feed 8 billion people without fertilizer. And when the supply of fertilizer gets disrupted, when the price of urea spikes because it can't be exported from the Gulf, the cost of growing food goes up everywhere on Earth. A British think tank has warned of long-term increases in food prices due to disruption in fuel and fertilizer markets. We are not just watching an energy crisis. We are watching the early stages of a food security crisis that will take years to fully manifest. Beyond energy, the conflict is disrupting key non-oil commodities, including methanol, aluminum, sulfur, and graphite, impacting global manufacturing and the green energy transition. Sulfur, which is critical for battery chemistry in electric vehicles and for producing phosphate fertilizers, has had nearly half of its global seaborne trade disrupted. Nearly half of all global seaborne sulfur trade passes through the strait, making the region the global price setter for the commodity. The green energy transition that we've been told is the future of global industry. It runs on minerals and chemicals whose supply chains now run straight through the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. The geopolitical map is shifting as well, and shifting in ways that will have permanent consequences, regardless of how and when this conflict ends. India and Pakistan have both sent naval assets to escort tankers in the Gulf of Oman. The Indian Navy launched Operation Urja Suraksha, deploying over 5 frontline warships, including destroyers and frigates, to escort over 20 Indian-flagged cargo ships stranded west of the strait. China, which receives a third of its oil via the strait, is watching this crisis with an intensity that should not be underestimated. Beijing has been running war games for scenarios exactly like this one for years. The Strait of Hormuz is China's Achilles heel, the single choke point that the United States, if it chose to, could use to strangle the Chinese economy. And watching America's inability to unilaterally reopen the strait tells Beijing something profound about the real limits of American naval dominance in a contested environment. Every analyst in the Chinese military apparatus is drawing conclusions from what they're watching right now. The peace negotiations have been stumbling. In-person talks between the US and Iran, hosted by Pakistan last month, failed to reach an agreement to end the war. Pakistan has been serving as a mediator, threading messages between Washington and Tehran. Iran's foreign ministry has confirmed it is reviewing American proposals, but the gap between what the US is demanding and what Iran will accept appears to be substantial. Iran began controlling traffic through the strait and charging tolls of over $1 million per ship, essentially establishing a new revenue stream and a new form of sovereignty over what international law defines as international waters. That is a radical act. It is Iran unilaterally rewriting the rules of maritime navigation in one of the world's most critical passages, and the United States, the self-designated guardian of the rules-based international order, is struggling to reverse it. Trump has oscillated between maximalist threats and conciliatory gestures with a speed that has left allies, adversaries, and markets struggling to calibrate. The US president has repeatedly sent prices plunging with a series of social media posts suggesting the war will end soon, which make it difficult for traders to bet with conviction on higher oil prices. This is governance by social media post in the middle of a geopolitical crisis that is reshaping the global energy architecture. And while some will say that uncertainty itself is a negotiating tool, the risk is that when you've cried peace so many times and peace hasn't arrived, the credibility of those signals erodes, and the market starts to price in the scenario where this doesn't resolve quickly. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas has estimated that if the strait remains closed through the second quarter of 2026, WTI oil prices are expected to reach $98 per barrel, and global real GDP growth would be lowered by an annualized 2.9 percentage points. Their more pessimistic models go further. A cessation of oil exports from the Persian Gulf lasting 2 quarters would cause the WTI price to peak at $132 per barrel, and lasting 3 quarters would cause the price to peak at $167 per barrel in October 2026. At $167 a barrel, the impact on inflation and growth roughly doubles, a stagflationary shock that could shift everything from the path ahead for central banks to the outcome of the US midterm elections. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas has estimated that if the strait remains closed through the second quarter of 2026, WTI oil prices are expected to reach $98 per barrel, and global real GDP growth would be lowered by an annualized 2.9 percentage points. Their more pessimistic models go further. A cessation of oil exports from the Persian Gulf lasting 2 quarters would cause the WTI price to peak at $132 per barrel, and lasting 3 quarters would cause the price to peak at $167 per barrel in October 2026. At $167 a barrel, the impact on inflation and growth roughly doubles, a stagflationary shock that could shift everything from the path ahead for central banks to the outcome of the US midterm elections. That word, stagflation, is the word that should be echoing in the back of every American's mind right now. Because stagflation is the economic condition that broke the Carter presidency. It's the condition that reshapes political landscapes in ways that are very difficult to reverse once they're set in motion. High inflation combined with slowing growth, prices going up, while economic activity contracts. The Federal Reserve caught between raising rates to fight inflation, which would strangle economic activity further, or cutting rates to stimulate growth, which would allow inflation to run even hotter. There is no clean exit from stagflation. There is only damage management. That word, stagflation, Adam, is the word that should be echoing in the back of every American's mind right now, because stagflation is the economic condition that broke the Carter presidency. It's the condition that reshapes political landscapes in ways that are very difficult to reverse once they're set in motion. High inflation combined with slowing growth. Prices going up while economic activity contracts. The Federal Reserve caught between raising rates to fight inflation, which would strangle economic activity further, or cutting rates to stimulate growth, which would allow inflation to run even hotter. There is no clean exit from stagflation. There is only damage management. And here is the deeper truth that all of this points toward. What we are watching in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a conflict between the United States and Iran, it is a stress test of the entire post-1945 international order. The order built on American military supremacy, on the dollar as the global reserve currency, on open sea lanes, on the idea that the United States and its allies set the rules of the game and everyone else plays by them. That order has been under strain for years, from the rise of China, from the fracturing of US-European relations, from the emergence of the BRICS bloc and its slow move toward alternative financial architectures, from the gradual erosion of dollar dominance in bilateral trade arrangements, the war in Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz have now delivered the most dramatic single test of that order since the end of the Cold War, and the verdict is not yet in. 3 American destroyers ran a gauntlet of missiles and drones and made it through. That is a display of military capability. But capability is not the same as control, and right now, in the most strategically important 21 miles of ocean on the planet, control remains genuinely contested. That is the story. That is what May 7, 2026 actually means. 3 American warships sailing through the most important stretch of water on the planet, and Iran fired everything it had at them: missiles, drones, small boats. That's what happened on May 7, 2026. And if you think this is just another news headline to scroll past, I want you to stop for a second and really think about what's unfolding here, because this is one of those moments where history doesn't knock politely. It kicks the door down. The USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Mason, 3 guided missile destroyers, were transiting the Strait of Hormuz when Iranian forces launched a coordinated barrage of multiple missiles, drones, and small attack boats against all 3 ships simultaneously. The US military intercepted every single threat. No American ship was struck. And then the US responded by hitting Iranian missile launch sites, command and control facilities, and surveillance infrastructure along the coastline. President Trump went on Truth Social and wrote that there was no damage done to the 3 destroyers, but great damage done to the Iranian attackers. He called it a love tap to reporters. But here's what nobody in mainstream media is stopping to explain to you: what this event actually means in the architecture of global power, global economics, and the future of a world order that is fracturing in real time right before our eyes. Because this isn't just about 3 ships, this is about who controls the arteries of the global economy. Until this